Clara Beth Hammond stepped off that dusty train in Valley Creek, Colorado territory, with eyes as dry as the prairie wind and a heart locked tighter than a bank vault. She hadn't shed a single tear in 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not since the night her own blood betrayed her for 30 pieces of silver and a debt forgiveness letter. What her family did to her would have broken most women, but Clara had learned something valuable in Baltimore's darkest corners. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Little did she know that a gentle rancher named Samuel Mitchell was about to teach her that some luxuries were worth risking everything to reclaim. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1887, and the Colorado Territory stretched wide and golden under an endless sky that seemed to promise redemption to anyone brave enough to start over. Valley Creek sat nestled between rolling hills where prairie grass swayed like ocean waves, and cottonwood trees lined the creek that gave the settlement its name. This was cattle country, where fortunes were made on the backs of longhorns and the strength of those willing to work from sunrise to sunset. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with early snow that warned of the harsh winter to come. In this land of second chances, the township of Valley Creek had grown from nothing more than a trading post into a proper community, with a main street lined with wooden boardwalks, a general store that smelled of coffee and leather, and a small white chapel where folks gathered every Sunday to give thanks for surviving another week. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of town, while St. Mary's Chapel stood sentinel at the other, as if the whole settlement balanced between salvation and sin. Here, where the wind carried the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle, reputation mattered less than character, and past mistakes could be buried as deep as a man was willing to dig. It was the perfect place for someone like Clara Hammond to disappear from who she used to be and maybe, just maybe, discover who she was meant to become. Samuel Mitchell had built his life at Riverside Ranch with the same steady patience he used to gentle wild horses. At 32, he possessed a kind of quiet strength that came from weathering life's storms without losing faith in tomorrow's sunrise. His hands were calloused from honest work, his face weathered by Colorado sun and wind, but his green eyes held a gentleness that made even the most skittish animals trust him. When folks in Valley Creek spoke of Sam Mitchell, they invariably mentioned two things: his way with horses and his uncommon kindness toward anyone who found themselves down on their luck. The ranch itself sprawled across 200 acres of prime grazing land, with Valley Creek meandering through the property like a silver ribbon. Sam had built the 2-story log house with his own hands after his first wife Sarah passed, needing something to do with his grief besides drowning in it. The wraparound porch faced east to catch the morning sun, and Sarah's vegetable garden still bloomed each spring, tended now by Sam with the same devotion he'd shown her memory. His younger brother Thomas worked the ranch alongside him, a cheerful soul of 26 who could rope a steer and charm the ladies at church socials with equal skill. Their hired hand, Jake Morrison, rounded out the small crew, a grizzled cowboy who drifted west after the war and never found a reason to keep drifting. Together, they'd built Riverside Ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory, known for raising quality horses as well as beef cattle. But success meant little to a man eating supper alone every night, listening to the creek babble outside his window and wondering if this was all life had to offer. Sam had loved Sarah with the kind of deep, abiding affection that comes once in a lifetime, and her death in childbirth 3 years ago had left a hole in his world that no amount of ranch work could fill. He wasn't looking for another Sarah. He knew better than that. But the idea of sharing his life with someone who might appreciate the simple pleasures of watching sunset paint the mountains purple had begun to take root in his heart. Clara Hammond arrived in Valley Creek carrying everything she owned in a worn carpet bag and a heart so carefully guarded that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hope. At 26, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that revealed itself slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Her dark hair was always pinned back severely. Her brown eyes held secrets she'd never tell, and her hands bore the calluses of a woman who'd learned to earn her keep with needle and thread. She'd been a seamstress in Baltimore, one of the finest in the city, creating elegant gowns for society ladies who looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Clara had skill enough to dress the wealthy and work ethic enough to support herself, but she'd made one critical mistake. She'd trusted her family to have her best interests at heart. Her father's gambling debts and her brother's failed business ventures had painted them into a corner, and when Charles Whitmore offered to clear their obligations in exchange for Clara's hand in marriage, they'd accepted without bothering to ask her opinion. Whitmore was old money Baltimore, the kind of man who collected beautiful things the way other men collected cattle or land. He had a wife already, of course, but she was sickly and childless, and he wanted Clara for purposes that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with ownership. The wedding was arranged quickly, quietly, with papers signed and money exchanged before Clara fully understood what was happening. But Clara Hammond hadn't survived 26 years by being anyone's victim. The night before the ceremony, she'd packed her bag, taken her savings, and disappeared into the maze of Baltimore's harbor district. For 3 months, she'd lived in boarding houses and worked wherever she could find needlework, always looking over her shoulder, always moving when she felt too settled. She'd answered Samuel Mitchell's advertisement, not out of romantic hope, but out of practical necessity. She needed distance from her past and a legitimate reason to be somewhere her family would never think to look. The advertisement itself had been different from the others she'd read. While most men advertised for wives like they were hiring farmhands, specifying cooking skills and childbearing capacity, Sam's notice had been simple and honest. Widowed rancher seeks companionship and partnership, can offer comfortable home, respectful treatment, and the opportunity to build something meaningful together. No false promises, just honest hope for a better future. Something in those words had spoken to the part of Clara that remembered believing in better futures. She'd written back with characteristic directness, explaining that she was educated, skilled with domestic work, and seeking a fresh start away from Baltimore. She'd been honest about her desire for marriage as protection rather than romance, and Sam had written back saying that honesty was the best foundation any partnership could have. Their correspondence had continued for 2 months, letters crossing the continent like tentative bridges between two lonely souls. Sam wrote about his ranch, his horses, and his quiet life in Valley Creek. Clara shared her love of books, her skill with sewing, and her dream of someday having a garden where she could grow herbs for cooking and healing. Neither mentioned love, but both wrote about hope, and sometimes that was enough to sustain the human heart. The morning Clara stepped off the train in Valley Creek, carrying her carpet bag and wearing her best dress, navy blue wool with pearl buttons she'd sewn herself. She felt like she was walking toward either salvation or another kind of trap. The platform was nothing more than weathered planks beside the tracks, with a small depot building that served as ticket office, telegraph station, and waiting room all in one. Mountains ringed the horizon like protective walls, and the air carried scents she'd never experienced: sage and pine, horse and leather, and something clean and wild that Baltimore's smoky streets had never offered. Samuel Mitchell was waiting for her, hat in hand, green eyes uncertain but kind. He was taller than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders, with the easy way of moving that came from years of physical work. When he spoke her name, Miss Hammond, his voice carried the same gentleness that had marked his letters. Clara nodded, studying this man who might become her husband, looking for signs of the cruelty she'd learned to recognize in Baltimore's drawing rooms. Instead, she saw calloused hands that held his hat carefully, boots that were worn but clean, and a face that bore witness to grief but hadn't been hardened by it. When he offered to carry her bag, he waited for her permission rather than simply taking it, and that small courtesy told her more about his character than a dozen letters could have conveyed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ride to Riverside Ranch in Sam's wagon gave Clara her first real look at the country that might become home. Valley Creek's main street bustled with the kind of activity that marked a community on the rise. Cowboys loading supplies, women in calico dresses shopping with children trailing behind, men in work clothes heading to or from jobs that built the territory one nail and one fence post at a time. The general store's windows displayed everything from bolts of fabric to horse tack, and the church bell tower rose above it all, like a promise that civilization had taken root in this wild place. But it was the land beyond town that truly captured Clara's attention. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, covered in grass that shifted from gold to green as clouds passed overhead. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered toys, and she could see riders working among them, tiny figures, against the vast backdrop of Colorado sky. The mountains seemed to change color as they drove, shifting from blue to purple to deep gray as the afternoon light evolved. "It's bigger than I imagined," Clara said finally, the first words she'd spoken since they'd left the depot. Sam smiled, and she noticed how it transformed his entire face. "Takes some getting used to," he agreed. "Sarah used to say it was like living inside a painting that somebody kept changing when you weren't looking." The mention of his first wife might have felt awkward, but Sam spoke of her with such natural affection that Clara found it comforting rather than threatening. A man who could speak lovingly of the dead was likely to treat the living with respect. And respect was all Clara dared hope for in this arrangement. Riverside Ranch revealed itself gradually as they followed the creek road toward the house. First came the pastures where horses grazed, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sam pointed out his favorites, a black stallion named Thunder, who'd been born wild and gentle through patience rather than force, a paint mare called Patches who could cut cattle like she was reading their minds, and a small herd of yearlings that would be broken to saddle come spring. The house itself sat on a small rise overlooking the creek, surrounded by cottonwood trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn yellow with approaching autumn. It was larger than Clara had expected, built of logs and timber with a stone foundation, and a roof designed to shed the heavy snows that would come with winter. The wraparound porch was furnished with simple wooden chairs, and she could see Sarah's garden stretching behind the house, still blooming with late-season vegetables and herbs. "Thomas and Jake will be wanting to meet you," Sam said as he helped her down from the wagon. "But I thought maybe you'd like to see the house first, get settled a bit before we spring company on you." Again, that consideration for her comfort, rather than his own convenience. Clara followed Sam up the porch steps, noting how solid everything felt beneath her feet. This was a house built to last, constructed by a man who planned to stay in one place long enough to call it home. The inside revealed the same careful attention to quality and comfort. The main room featured a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space, with hand-hewn furniture that showed Sam's skill with woodworking tools. Books lined shelves on either side of the fireplace, and Clara felt her first genuine spark of interest since arriving. A man who read was a man who thought about things beyond the immediate demands of survival. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a cast-iron stove, a hand pump that brought creek water right to the sink, and windows that looked out over the garden and pastures beyond. Upstairs, Sam showed her to a room that would be hers until they married, A simple space with a bed covered in one of Sarah's quilts, a dresser with a mirror, and windows that faced east toward the mountains. "I know this is all strange," Sam said as Clara set her bag on the bed. "We can take as much time as you need to feel comfortable here. The preacher says we'll need at least 2 weeks to post the banns properly, and there's no rush beyond that." Clara turned to study this man, who'd brought her across the continent with promises of respectful treatment and honest hope. In the golden light filtering through the bedroom windows, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow, the careful way he kept his distance while making sure she felt welcome, and the genuine concern in his expression as he waited for her response. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it more than any word she'd spoken in years. For the first time since Baltimore, Clara Hammond began to think that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where the past couldn't follow and the future might hold something besides fear. That evening, as she sat on the porch, listening to the creek murmur in the darkness and watching stars appear in a sky larger than any she'd ever imagined, Clara felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was dead forever. It wasn't love. She was too smart and too careful for that. But it was possibility, and sometimes possibility was enough to keep a woman going until something better came along. What Clara didn't know, as she sat in the Colorado darkness planning a future built on practical hope rather than romantic dreams, was that Samuel Mitchell was already planning ways to make her smile. And what Sam didn't know, as he lay in his own bed listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving around his house, was that the woman sleeping down the hall carried wounds that would take more than kindness to heal. But they had time, and they had honesty, and sometimes that was enough to build something that neither of them had dared to imagine when they'd first put pen to paper and reached across the continent toward a stranger who might understand what it meant to start over. Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing and water running somewhere below her window. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, wrapped in Sarah Mitchell's wedding ring quilt, trying to remember where she was and why the air smelled of pine instead of coal smoke and harbor brine. Then it all came flooding back. The train journey, the vast Colorado sky, and Samuel Mitchell's gentle hands as he'd helped her down from the wagon. Sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows, painting golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. Clara had forgotten what it felt like to wake to natural light instead of the grey dawn that filtered through Baltimore's smoky air. She could hear voices from somewhere outside, men talking in the easy way of people who work together without needing to watch their words. And underneath it all, the constant murmur of Valley Creek as it wound its way through the ranch. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, brown wool with small pearl buttons, and pinned her dark hair back in the severe style she'd adopted since leaving Baltimore. In the small mirror above the dresser, her reflection looked pale and serious, like a woman attending a funeral rather than beginning a new life. Clara had learned to school her features into pleasant neutrality, never revealing too much of what she thought or felt. It was safer that way, and safety had become her primary concern since the night her family had sold her future for the price of their debts. Downstairs, she found the kitchen empty but warm, with coffee keeping hot on the stove and a plate of biscuits covered with a clean kitchen towel. A note in Sam's careful handwriting explained that he'd gone to check the cattle with Thomas and Jake, but there was food for breakfast, and he'd be back by mid-morning to show her around the ranch properly. Clara appreciated that he'd given her space to settle in without hovering, but the empty house felt strange after months of crowded boarding. Houses where privacy was a luxury no one could afford. She took her coffee out to the porch, where morning light revealed details she'd missed in yesterday's failing daylight. The vegetable garden stretched behind the house in neat rows, heavy with late-season tomatoes, squash, and beans. Someone, had built raised beds for herbs. She could smell basil and rosemary from where she sat, and morning glories climbed a trellis near the kitchen door. It was the kind of garden Clara had dreamed of having someday, practical but beautiful, designed by someone who understood that feeding the body and nourishing the soul weren't separate concerns. The creek ran perhaps 50 yards from the house, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. Beyond the water, pastures rolled away toward distant mountains, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. She could see riders working among the herd, too far away to identify, but their easy competence was evident even at this range. These were men who knew their business, who could read weather and cattle and grass the way Clara could read the grain of fabric or the tension in a seam. When Sam returned around 10 o'clock, Clara was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching a red-winged blackbird defend its territory against a bold blue jay. She'd been thinking about Baltimore, about the life she'd left behind, and about the strange turn of events that had brought her to this porch overlooking Colorado rangeland. 6 months ago, she'd been measuring society ladies for ball gowns and living in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Kowalski's bakery. Now, she was preparing to marry a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, in a place so far from everything familiar that it might as well have been another planet. "Morning," Sam said, swinging down from his horse with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding since childhood. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "It's so quiet here." Sam smiled. And again she noticed how it transformed his weathered features. "Takes some getting used to if you're accustomed to city noise. Sarah used to say the silence was so loud it kept her awake the first few weeks." He seemed to realize what he'd said and looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether mentioning his first wife would upset her. Clara found his concern touching rather than irritating. A man who could speak naturally about his deceased wife was a man who'd loved deeply and grieved honestly, qualities that spoke well of his character. "I'd like to hear about her sometime," Clara said carefully. "If you don't mind talking about it." Sam's expression softened with what might have been relief. "She was a good woman. You'd have liked her, I think. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, even when we had nothing but beans and cornbread to offer." The easy way he spoke of Sarah told Clara more about the kind of marriage she might expect than any number of formal declarations could have conveyed. This was a man who'd been truly partnered with his wife, not merely served by her, and that distinction mattered more than Clara had realized it would. Thomas Mitchell appeared around the corner of the barn, leading a limping sorrel, gelding and talking to the horse in the soothing tones people used with frightened children. He was younger than Sam by several years, with the same green eyes but a more open, cheerful demeanor. Where Sam's kindness ran deep and quiet, Thomas wore his heart on his sleeve, and Clara could see him trying not to stare as he approached the house. "Clara, this is my brother Thomas," Sam said. "Tom, Miss Hammond." Thomas touched his hat brim with his free hand, grinning despite his obvious concern for the injured horse. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Hammond. Sorry I wasn't here yesterday. When you arrived, we had a heifer calving that needed some help." "Is the horse badly hurt?" Clara asked, noting the careful way the animal favored its left front hoof. "Stone bruise, most likely," Thomas replied. "Old Charlie here decided to step on something sharp while we were moving cattle yesterday. Sam's got a better touch with horse doctoring than either Jake or me." Sam was already examining the gelding's hoof, running gentle hands down the leg and speaking in low, calming tones. The horse stood quietly, ears pricked forward, clearly trusting the man who held his foot. Clara watched the process with interest, noting how Sam's patience and careful movements kept the animal relaxed even though it was obviously in pain. "There's the problem," Sam said, showing them a sharp stone wedged near the frog of the hoof. Been there a while by the look of it. We'll need to soak this and keep him on soft ground for a few days. The care with which Sam removed the stone and examined the damaged tissue spoke to a gentleness that extended beyond humans to every creature under his protection. Clara found herself thinking of Charles Whitmore, who'd once struck a carriage horse across the face for shying at a loud noise, and the contrast made her chest tighten with something that might have been gratitude. Jake Morrison joined them as Sam was bandaging Charlie's hoof, a grizzled man in his 50s with shrewd blue eyes and hands scarred by decades of rope work. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion, and when he touched his hat to Clara, she sensed evaluation rather than mere courtesy. "Ma'am," Jake said simply, then turned to Sam. "That heifer Tom mentioned, she's doing fine, calf too. Strong little bull, looks like he'll be a good one." "Glad to hear it," Sam replied, finishing with Charlie's bandage. "Clara, Jake here runs the day-to-day operations when I'm not around. Been with us since right after Sarah passed. Don't know what we'd do without him." Jake's weathered face showed the faintest hint of a smile. "Probably get along just fine, but I appreciate the steady work and decent grub." He studied Clara with the directness of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "You planning to stay on, miss? Or just passing through?" The question was blunt, but not unkind, and Clara appreciated his honesty. These men needed to know whether she was committed to making a life here or simply using marriage as a temporary refuge from her troubles. "I'm planning to stay," she said quietly, "if Mr. Mitchell will have me." Something in Jake's expression shifted, and he nodded once with apparent satisfaction. "Good. This place needs a woman's touch, and Sam's been alone too long." The simple acceptance in his words warmed Clara in a way she hadn't expected. She'd grown accustomed to being evaluated as a commodity, valued for her appearance or her skills, but rarely for her potential as a person. These men seemed to see her as someone who might contribute to their small community rather than merely ornament it. Sam showed her around the ranch that afternoon, pointing out the different pastures, the breeding program he'd developed for both cattle and horses, and the improvements he'd made since taking over the property 5 years earlier. His pride in the work was evident but not boastful, the satisfaction of a man who'd built something worthwhile with his own hands and careful planning. The horses drew Clara's attention more than the cattle, perhaps because of the individual attention Sam gave each animal. He knew their names, their personalities, their strengths and weaknesses, speaking of them like a teacher might discuss promising students. Thunder, the black stallion, was brilliant but temperamental, requiring patience and respect rather than force. Patches, the paint mare, was steady and intelligent, perfect for working cattle but gentle enough for a child to ride. The yearlings showed promise but needed careful training to develop their potential properly. "I've been thinking about expanding the horse operation," Sam said as they watched a group of 2-year-olds grazing in the home pasture. "There's good demand for well-trained mounts, especially from the cavalry posts and the mining companies up in the mountains. But it takes time to do it right, and time is something I haven't had enough of lately." Clara heard the unspoken implication. With a wife to help manage the household duties, he'd have more time to focus on the work that interested him most. It was a practical partnership she could understand and respect, based on mutual benefit rather than romantic sentiment. They were walking back toward the house when they encountered a scene that would later stand out in Clara's memory as the moment she began to truly see who Samuel Mitchell was beneath his quiet exterior. A young Mustang, probably no more than 3 years old, had somehow gotten tangled in a piece of loose fencing wire near the creek. The horse was panicked, fighting the restraint and likely to injure itself seriously if it continued thrashing. Most men would have approached with ropes and force, attempting to subdue the animal quickly before it could hurt itself worse. Sam moved differently, slowly and calmly, speaking in low tones that seemed to reach something primitive in the horse's frightened mind. He didn't try to grab the animal or dominate it through strength. Instead, he seemed to communicate safety and patience, gradually earning enough trust to approach close enough to free the trapped leg. The process took nearly an hour, with Sam never raising his voice or making a sudden movement that might trigger another panic response. Clara watched from a safe distance, fascinated by the interplay between man and animal, the gradual building of trust that allowed cooperation instead of conflict. When the Mustang finally stood free, it didn't bolt immediately. Instead, it regarded Sam with what looked almost like gratitude before trotting away toward the hills. "Where did you learn to do that?" Clara asked as they continued toward the house. Sam considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider most things. "My father, mostly. He always said you could tell a man's true character by how he treated animals that couldn't fight back. Animals don't lie about who you are. They see straight through to what's real." The simple philosophy revealed more about Sam's worldview than a dozen conversations might have accomplished. Here was a man who believed in earning trust rather than demanding obedience, in solving problems through patience rather than force. Clara found herself wondering what it would be like to be treated with such careful consideration, to have someone invest that kind of time and attention in understanding her fears rather than simply expecting her to overcome them. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Clara found herself studying Sam's profile in the fading light. He was whittling something from a piece of pine, his hands sure and steady as he coaxed shape from raw wood. The easy concentration on his face reminded her of her own absorption when working on a particularly complex piece of sewing, the satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful from simple materials. "What are you making?" she asked. Sam held up a partially carved bird, still rough, but recognizably taking the shape of a meadowlark. "Sarah used to love hearing them sing in the morning. I started carving them after she passed. Don't really know why. Gives my hands something to do when I'm thinking." The admission revealed an unexpected vulnerability, a glimpse of how this strong, competent man had processed his grief. Clara thought of her own coping mechanisms, the rigid control of her emotions, the careful walls she'd built around her heart, and wondered what it would be like to have a creative outlet for pain instead of simply burying it deeper. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. "You're very skilled." Sam's hands stilled on the carving, and he looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "Thank you, it's just something to pass the time." But Clara could see it was more than that. The careful attention to detail, the patient work of bringing life to dead wood, spoke to the same gentleness he'd shown with the injured horse and the tangled Mustang. This was a man who believed in healing rather than breaking, in building rather than tearing down. As the stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Clara found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this porch, to this man, to this moment of unexpected peace. 6 months ago, she would never have imagined sitting beside a stranger in the wilderness, feeling safer than she had in her own family's house. The betrayal that had driven her from Baltimore seemed both distant and immediate, a wound that had shaped her but didn't have to define her future. Sam finished the meadowlark as full darkness settled over the ranch, the final details emerging under the steady work of his knife. When he handed it to her, warm from his hands and smooth as silk, Clara felt something crack in the careful armor she'd built around her heart. Not break exactly, but shift enough to let in a small ray of possibility. "For you," Sam said simply. Welcome to Riverside Ranch. Clara held the small wooden bird carefully, running her fingers over the delicate feathers Sam had carved with such patient skill. In Baltimore, she'd received expensive gifts from men who wanted to own her, jewelry and silk that came with invisible strings attached. This simple offering, made by Sam's own hands with no expectation beyond her pleasure in it, touched something in her that expensive trinkets never could. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time in over 2 years, Clara Hammond felt tears threaten behind her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, automatically, the habit of emotional control too strong to break in a single moment. But something had shifted, some small part of the ice around her heart beginning to thaw under the gentle warmth of unexpected kindness. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and oddly comfortable to Clara. She woke each morning to mountain light and the sound of men beginning their work, took her coffee on the porch while watching the ranch come alive around her, and spent her days learning the routines that would soon become her own. Sam was unfailingly considerate, including her in conversations about ranch business without expecting her to have opinions about matters she didn't understand, sharing meals and quiet evenings without pushing for intimacy she wasn't ready to offer. Thomas proved to be a cheerful companion, full of stories about growing up in Colorado and always ready with a joke or observation that brought smiles to even Clara's carefully guarded face. Jake remained more reserved, but gradually warmed to her presence, especially after she mended a torn shirt for him with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. In Baltimore, such domestic skills had been expected and undervalued. Here, they were appreciated as genuine contributions to the household's welfare. Clara began to understand why Sam had been successful with both horses and cattle. He approached everything with the same patient observation, watching for signs of stress or illness, adjusting his methods to suit individual needs rather than trying to force universal solutions. When a young cow developed mastitis, he treated her with careful attention until she recovered. When one of the yearling colts showed signs of lameness, he modified the training schedule rather than pushing through potential injury. This philosophy extended to his treatment of Clara herself. He seemed to sense her need for space and time, never pressing for conversations about her past or expectations for their future beyond the practical arrangements of their upcoming marriage. When she flinched away from unexpected touch, a brush of hands reaching for the same cup, an accidental bump in the kitchen doorway, he stepped back without question or offense, giving her the room she needed to feel safe. But beneath his patience, Clara began to sense a deeper current of loneliness that matched her own. She caught him sometimes in unguarded moments, staring toward the mountains with an expression of such profound solitude that it made her chest ache with recognition. Here was a man who'd learned to be content with his own company, but who hadn't forgotten what it felt like to share life's daily moments with someone who truly understood them. The realization that she might have something to offer beyond domestic services came gradually, emerging through small interactions that revealed common ground she hadn't expected to find. When Sam mentioned missing the books Sarah used to read aloud in the evenings, Clara offered to continue the tradition, and they spent several pleasant hours by the fire as she read from a volume of Tennyson's poetry they both enjoyed. When he struggled with correspondence to horse buyers back east, Clara's education proved useful in crafting letters that conveyed both professionalism and the personal touch that made business relationships profitable. Most surprisingly, Clara found herself genuinely interested in the ranch operations, asking questions about breeding decisions and training methods that went beyond polite conversation. Sam seemed pleased by her curiosity, explaining his reasoning behind various choices and seeking her opinions on matters where her different perspective might prove valuable. One afternoon, as they watched Thomas work with a particularly stubborn 2-year-old colt, Clara made an observation that surprised them both. "He's not being difficult," she said, studying the young horse's body language. "He's confused. The signals aren't clear enough for him to understand what's expected." Sam looked at her with new interest. "What makes you think so?" Clara pointed to the colt's ears, which flicked constantly between Thomas and the training pen fence. "He wants to cooperate. You can see it in how he turns toward Thomas, but something about the lesson isn't making sense to him." Sam watched for several more minutes, then called out suggestions to Thomas about clarifying his cues and breaking the lesson down into smaller steps. The change in the colt's behavior was immediate and dramatic, confusion replaced by eager cooperation as the training suddenly made sense. "You've got a good eye," Sam said to Clara, his approval evident. "Have you worked with horses before?" "Not really," Clara admitted, "but I understand confusion. I know what it looks like when someone wants to do the right thing but doesn't. Know what that is." The words carried more weight than she'd intended, revealing truths about her own experience that she rarely acknowledged even to herself. Sam seemed to hear the deeper meaning, and his expression softened with something that looked like understanding. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is make expectations clear," he said gently. "People and animals both do better when they know what's wanted of them." It was as close as he'd come to acknowledging the uncertainty of her position at Riverside Ranch, the questions about what kind of marriage they were building and what she might expect from their partnership. Clara appreciated that he'd given her an opening to discuss their arrangement without forcing the conversation. "What do you expect from me?" she asked, matching his directness. "As your wife, I mean, beyond the obvious domestic duties." Sam was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas continue working with the now cooperative colt. When he spoke, his words were careful but honest. "I expect partnership," he said finally. "Someone who'll share the work and the worry, the good times and the hard ones. I don't need someone to take care of me. I've been managing well enough on my own. But I'd like someone to care about what happens here, to have a stake in making it better." He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I won't lie and say I don't hope for affection eventually, but I know that takes time to build, especially for someone who's been hurt before. I'm willing to wait for whatever you can give when you're ready to give it." The simple declaration, free of demands or ultimatums, touched Clara more deeply than any passionate declaration might have done. Here was a man offering partnership on terms she could understand and accept, with room for growth but no pressure. For immediate intimacy. "I think I can manage partnership," Clara said quietly. "The rest, we'll see what develops." Sam nodded, apparently satisfied with her honest uncertainty. "That's all anyone can promise, really. We'll figure it out as we go." As they walked back toward the house, Clara felt something settle in her chest that might have been the beginning of hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had driven her to answer his advertisement, but something steadier and more sustainable. She was beginning to believe that she might have found not just refuge, but a place where she could rebuild something approaching a normal life. That evening, as she sat on the porch mending one of Sam's shirts by lamplight, Clara allowed herself to imagine what that life might look like. Rising each morning to mountain light and meaningful work, sharing meals and conversation with people who valued her contributions, perhaps even finding affection with a man who seemed to understand that trust was something to be earned rather than demanded. The future was far from certain, and Clara knew better than to count on happiness she hadn't yet secured. But for the first time since leaving Baltimore, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring today. And sometimes, she thought as she watched Sam carve another small bird by the firelight, that was enough to build a life on. The wooden meadowlark he'd given her sat on her bedside table, a reminder that some gifts came without strings attached, that some people offered kindness simply because it was their nature to do so. Clara fell asleep each night, looking at that small carved bird, and sometimes she thought she could almost hear it singing. The first frost came early that year, painting the cottonwood leaves silver in the pre-dawn light and reminding everyone, at Riverside Ranch that winter, preparations couldn't wait much longer. Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Sam and Thomas move cattle to the lower pastures, their breath visible in the crisp air as they worked with the efficient coordination of men who'd done this dance many times before. She'd been at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks now, and the rhythm of the place had begun to feel familiar, even comfortable. But something was shifting inside her that had nothing to do with seasonal changes. The shift had started 3 days earlier when Margaret O'Brien had arrived at the ranch in her husband's medical buggy, ostensibly to check on Charlie's healing hoof, but clearly more interested in meeting the woman who'd traveled from Baltimore to marry Samuel Mitchell. Dr. O'Brien served the scattered ranches and mining camps within a day's ride of Valley Creek, and his wife often accompanied him on his rounds, serving as unofficial midwife and general source of medical wisdom for the women of the territory. Margaret was perhaps 40 years old, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady competence that came from years of dealing with frontier emergencies without flinching. She'd examined Charlie's hoof with professional thoroughness, pronounced it healing well, then turned her attention to Clara with the same direct assessment. "So you're the seamstress from Baltimore," Margaret had said, settling herself at Clara's kitchen table with the ease of someone accustomed to making herself welcome. "Sam's been talking about you at church, and the whole township's curious about the woman brave enough to marry our most eligible bachelor." Clara had tensed at being called brave, knowing the truth was closer to desperate, but something in Margaret's manner suggested genuine interest rather than mere gossip gathering. Over coffee and the apple cake Clara had learned to make from Sarah's handwritten recipe, Margaret had shared news from town, updates on mutual acquaintances, and the kind of comfortable conversation that Clara hadn't realized she'd been missing. "You settling in well?" Margaret had asked, and the question carried weight beyond simple politeness. "Better than I expected," Clara had answered honestly. "It's very different from city life, but not unpleasantly so." Margaret had studied her with the keen observation of someone trained to read symptoms others might miss. "Sam's a good man, lost Sarah hard, but he's got too much life left in him to waste it grieving forever. You planning to make him happy?" The blunt question might have offended Clara coming from someone else, but Margaret asked it with the matter-of-fact concern of a woman who'd seen too many frontier marriages fail for want of honest communication. "I'm planning to be a good wife to him," Clara had replied carefully. "Whether that makes him happy remains to be seen." Margaret had nodded approvingly. "Fair enough. Happiness isn't something you can promise anyway, just something you work toward together. But I'll tell you this much, that man's been alone too long, and he's got enough kindness stored up to last a dozen women a lifetime. Don't waste it." The conversation had stayed with Clara for days, especially Margaret's observation about Sam's stored-up kindness. She'd begun watching him more carefully, noting the small gestures that revealed a man accustomed to caring for others. The way he always served her coffee before pouring his own, how he'd quietly oiled the hinges on her bedroom door when they'd begun to squeak, the patience he showed with Thomas's occasional lapses in judgment or Jake's gruff complaints. About the weather, most telling, was what she'd witnessed the previous evening when a neighbor had arrived seeking help with a difficult carving. Sam had dropped his own work without hesitation, gathered his equipment, and ridden out into the growing darkness to spend most of the night helping save both cow and calf. He'd returned near dawn, exhausted and covered in mud, asking only for hot coffee and clean clothes before beginning his regular morning routine. Clara had watched this sequence of events from her bedroom window, struck by the automatic way Sam responded to others' needs, as if the possibility of refusing help had never occurred to him. It was the kind of instinctive generosity that couldn't be faked or performed for effect, and it made her think about Margaret's warning not to waste. Such a rare gift. But recognizing Sam's character only made Clara more aware of her own emotional limitations. She could see his kindness, appreciate his patience, even enjoy his company, but the deeper responses that should accompany such feelings remained locked away behind walls she'd built for survival. Sometimes she caught him watching her with a puzzled expression, as if he were trying to solve a problem he couldn't quite identify, and she knew he was sensing the distance she maintained even in their most comfortable moments together. The awareness of her own inadequacy had been weighing on Clara's mind as she prepared breakfast that frosty morning, thinking about the wedding planned for the following week and wondering what kind of wife she could be to a man who deserved so much more than she seemed capable of giving. She was lost in these troubling thoughts when Sam returned from moving cattle, stamping his boots on the porch to knock off the mud before entering the warm kitchen. "Smells good in here," he said. Hanging his hat on the peg by the door and moving to the stove to pour coffee from the pot Clara always kept ready. "That's Sarah's cornbread recipe, isn't it?" Clara nodded, pleased that she'd managed to recreate the texture and flavor from the careful notes Sarah had left in her recipe book. "Thomas mentioned it was his favorite, so I thought I'd try it." Sam smiled, the expression transforming his weather-beaten features in the way that still surprised Clara with its warmth. "Tom's got a sweet tooth that's gotten him in trouble more than once. Sarah used to say he'd charm his way into any kitchen in the territory if it meant getting a second piece of dessert." The easy way Sam spoke of his first wife had become one of the things Clara appreciated most about him. He didn't treat Sarah's memory as something fragile that needed protection, nor did he act as if mentioning her would somehow betray his commitment to Clara. Instead, he spoke of her naturally, including her presence in the ranch's daily life, without making Clara feel like an inadequate replacement. "Tell me about her," Clara said impulsively, then immediately regretted the request. She'd meant to keep the conversation light, but something in Sam's expression as he'd mentioned Sarah had made her genuinely curious about the woman who'd shared his life before. Sam considered the question while he added cream to his coffee, his face thoughtful rather than pained. "She was a teacher before we married, came out from Ohio to start a school in Valley Creek. Smart as anyone I've ever met, but practical with it. Could discuss literature or philosophy all evening, then get up before dawn to help with calving season." He paused, looking out the window toward the mountains where morning light was beginning to paint the peaks gold and purple. She had this way of making ordinary things seem special. Sunday dinners, evening conversations, even mucking out stalls. Somehow, she found joy in all of it. Made me see this place differently, appreciate what we were building here. Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation that had become her body's automatic response to discussions of emotions she couldn't access. Sarah sounded like everything Clara wasn't. Joyful, engaged, emotionally available. The comparison should have been discouraging, but instead, Clara found herself wondering what it would feel like to find joy in ordinary moments, to see the ranch through eyes, unclouded by suspicion and self-protection. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said quietly, meaning it despite the ache it caused. "She was," Sam agreed. "But she's gone, and life keeps moving forward. I learned that trying to recreate what you've lost is just another way of staying stuck in the past." The observation carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and Clara understood that Sam was telling her something important about his expectations for their marriage. He wasn't looking for another Sarah, wasn't trying to fit Clara into a mold shaped by his first wife's memory. It was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it meant she wouldn't be constantly measured against an impossible standard. Terrifying because it meant Sam might actually see her clearly enough to recognize how little she had to offer. Thomas burst through the kitchen door at that moment, bringing cold air and the scent of horses with him, his face bright with excitement that made him look younger than his 26 years. "Sam, you need to come see this," he said, accepting the coffee Clara poured for him without pausing in his enthusiasm. "That Mustang you freed from the fence wire last week, he's back and he's brought friends." Sam's eyebrows rose with interest. "How many friends?" "At least 6, maybe 8. They're grazing in the north pasture, bold as brass. The lead mare's got a foal with her, can't be more than a few months old." Clara saw the gleam that entered Sam's eyes at this news and recognized it as the same expression he wore when discussing particularly promising yearlings or innovative training techniques. Wild horses represented opportunity to a man with Sam's skills. The chance to add valuable animals to his breeding program if they could be captured and gentled properly. "They're probably coming down from the high country early because of the cold snap," Sam mused. "Winter's going to be harder than usual if they're already seeking lower elevations. Want me to ride into town and see if I can round up some help?" Thomas asked. "Bill Henderson's been talking about wanting to try his hand at Mustang hunting, and the Copper Creek boys are always ready for excitement." Sam shook his head slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Not yet. Let's watch them for a few days, see what their patterns are. Mustangs are smart. They don't stay anywhere that doesn't feel safe. If we can figure out what's keeping them comfortable here, we might be able to work with that instead of against it." Clara listened to the conversation with growing interest, struck by the difference between Sam's approach and what she'd expected from men discussing wild horse capture. In Baltimore, she'd heard enough stories about Western roundups to imagine violent confrontations between cowboys and Mustangs, all dust and danger and broken bones. Sam seemed to be contemplating something more like negotiation than conquest. "Can I see them?" she asked, surprising herself with the request. Both men looked at her with expressions that suggested they'd forgotten she was listening, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd spoken without thinking, responding to curiosity she hadn't realized she felt. "It's rough country," Sam said carefully, "and we'd have to go on horseback." "I can ride," Clara replied, though the truth was, she'd only ridden side saddle in Baltimore parks, nothing like the kind of riding that ranch life required. Thomas grinned at her declaration, clearly delighted by her interest. "I could saddle Buttercup for you. She's gentle as a lamb and steady as a rock." Sam's expression remained doubtful, but Clara caught something that might have been pleased. Surprise in his eyes. "Have you ridden much?" "Some," Clara answered honestly. "Not like you mean probably, but I'm not afraid of horses." The last part was true, at least. Something about the horses at Riverside Ranch appealed to Clara in a way she hadn't expected, their combination of power and grace reminding her of the fine fabrics she'd once worked with, beautiful materials that responded to skill and patience, but could be ruined by rough handling. Sam studied her for a moment longer, then nodded with apparent decision. "We'll take the easy trail and stay well back from the herd. But if I say we need to leave, we leave immediately. Mustangs can be unpredictable, especially with a foal in the group." An hour later, Clara found herself mounted on a placid bay mare, following Sam and Thomas along a winding path that led through stands of aspen and pine toward the ranch's northern boundary. Buttercup proved to be everything Thomas had promised. Calm, steady, and apparently willing to follow the other horses without requiring much guidance from her inexperienced rider. The trail climbed gradually through country that Clara was beginning to recognize as quintessentially Colorado. Rolling meadows dotted with stands of evergreens, rocky outcroppings that caught and held morning light, and always the mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. The air was crisp and thin, carrying scents of pine and sage that Baltimore's smoky atmosphere had never offered. Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm of riding in a way she hadn't expected. her body adjusting to Buttercup's steady gait, while her eyes took in landscapes that seemed designed to remind humans of their proper place in the larger scheme of creation. The vast scale of everything, sky, mountains, rolling grassland, should have been intimidating, but instead, Clara felt something approaching peace settle over her as they rode. "There," Sam said quietly, pointing toward a distant meadow where dark shapes moved against the golden grass. Clara squinted in the direction he indicated and gradually made out the forms of horses grazing in loose formation across the open space. Even at this distance, she could see the alertness that marked them as wild creatures, heads lifting frequently to test the wind for signs of danger, bodies positioned for quick flight if necessary. Sam dismounted and helped Clara down from Buttercup, then led them to a position behind a screen of pine trees that offered a clear view of the meadow, while keeping them concealed from the grazing horses. Through the branches, Clara got her first close look at genuine wild mustangs, and the sight took her breath away. The lead mare was a magnificent sorrel with a white blaze down her face, standing perhaps 15 hands high with the kind of compact muscular build that spoke of generations of survival in harsh country. She grazed with constant vigilance, never allowing her attention to focus completely on the grass, always ready to alert her herd to potential threats. The foal Thomas had mentioned stayed close to the mare's side, a leggy bay colt with oversized ears and the awkward grace of youth. He seemed less concerned with danger than with play, occasionally breaking away from his mother's side to investigate interesting rocks or challenge other young horses to impromptu races across the meadow. The rest of the herd showed the mixed, breeding typical of wild horses, bays and blacks and pintos, some showing the refined lines that suggested domestic ancestry, others carrying the heavier bone and primitive markings of horses that had never known human handling. They moved together with the fluid coordination of a group that had learned to depend on each other for survival. "They're beautiful," Clara whispered, not wanting her voice to carry across the distance and spook the herd. "That they are," Sam agreed, his own voice soft with appreciation. "Look at the chest on that black stallion. He'd throw some fine colts if we could get him to our mares." Clara followed his gaze to a magnificent black horse standing slightly apart from the main group, clearly the herd's guardian and breeding stallion. He was larger than the others, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in a group of impressive animals. His neck arched proudly as he surveyed his domain, and when he moved, it was with the controlled power of a creature absolutely confident in his own strength. "How would you capture them?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about the process. "Carefully," Sam replied with a slight smile. "And probably not all of them. Wild horses have been taking care of themselves out here for generations. They've earned the right to keep doing it. But sometimes a few will choose to join up with domestic herds, especially if winter's going to be particularly hard." He pointed toward a section of the meadow where a natural rock formation created a funnel-shaped depression. "If we set up temporary corrals in the right places and used riders to encourage them gently in that direction, we might be able to give them a choice. Come down to the ranch for feed and shelter during the worst weather, or head back up into the mountains when spring comes." The approach Sam described was unlike anything Clara had heard about wild horse roundups, lacking the violence and drama she'd expected, but requiring far more patience and understanding of animal behavior. It was typical of his general philosophy, she realized, working with natural inclinations rather than against them, offering partnership rather than demanding submission. They watched the herd for nearly an hour, noting the patterns of movement and the individual personalities that emerged as the horses interacted with each other. The lead mare was clearly the decision-maker, the one who determined when and where the group moved. The stallion provided protection, but seemed to defer to her judgment about day-to-day activities. The younger animals played and tested boundaries, while the older horses maintained vigilant watch over their surroundings. Clara found herself particularly drawn to a young pinto mare who stood slightly apart from the main group, not quite accepted by the others, but not entirely excluded either. Something about the horse's isolation reminded Clara of her own position at Riverside Ranch. Present, but not fully integrated, welcomed, but still waiting to find her true place in the community. "That one's interesting," Sam said, following Clara's gaze to the pinto. "See how she watches the others, but doesn't quite join in? She's probably from a different herd originally, maybe lost her family to predators or disease. The lead mare's letting her travel with them, but she hasn't earned full acceptance yet." "Will she?" Clara asked. "Depends on whether she proves herself useful to the group. Horses are practical creatures. They judge by actions, not intentions. If she carries her weight and doesn't cause problems, they'll eventually accept her as family." The parallel to Clara's own situation was so obvious that she wondered if Sam had chosen his words deliberately. But his expression showed only genuine interest in the horse's behavior. Still, Clara felt the observation settle into her thoughts. Like a seed planted in fertile ground, perhaps earning her place at Riverside Ranch was less about being perfect and more about proving herself useful and trustworthy over time. The return ride to the ranch house passed in comfortable conversation about what they'd observed, with Thomas full of enthusiasm for the possibilities the wild herd represented, and Sam more cautious but clearly interested in the opportunity they might provide. Clara contributed her own observations about individual horses' behaviors, pleased to discover that her instincts about animal psychology seemed reasonably accurate. "You've got a good eye for horses," Sam told her as they unsaddled the mounts. "In the barn, that pinto you noticed, I'd been watching her too. There's something about her that suggests she'd adapt well to domestic life if given the chance." The praise warmed Clara more than it probably should have, coming as it did from a man whose expertise with horses was widely recognized throughout the territory. She'd spent so many months feeling incompetent and out of place that having her observations validated felt like unexpected sunshine after a long winter. That evening, as they sat on the porch sharing the apple cake Clara had made that morning, the conversation turned to plans for the wedding scheduled for the following Saturday. Pastor Wells had confirmed that all the necessary arrangements were in place, and Margaret O'Brien had volunteered to help Clara with any last-minute preparations that might be needed. "It won't be fancy," Sam said, apparently feeling the need to manage Clara's expectations. "Just the folks from town and the neighboring ranches, maybe 30 people altogether. Pastor Wells will say the words, and Margaret's organized the ladies to provide food for afterward." "That sounds perfect," Clara assured him, and meant it. The thought of a large, elaborate ceremony would have terrified her, bringing back memories of the Baltimore wedding she'd fled from in the middle of the night. A simple frontier wedding with people who'd begun to feel like neighbors seemed much more manageable. "There's something else we should discuss," Sam said, his tone becoming more serious. "About expectations after we're married, I mean. I don't want you to feel pressured about anything, but I also don't want misunderstandings to develop, because we haven't talked about practical matters." Clara felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety, but forced herself to meet his eyes directly. "What kind of practical matters?" "Where we'll sleep, for one thing," Sam said with characteristic directness. "The house has 4 bedrooms upstairs. You can keep the one you're using now for as long as you want, or we can share the larger room that used to be mine and Sarah's. Whatever makes you comfortable." The careful way he presented the options told Clara that Sam was offering her control over the pace of their physical relationship, a consideration that few men in her experience would have thought to extend. The gesture meant more to her than he probably realized, representing the kind of respect for her autonomy that she'd never expected to find in marriage. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that we should start with separate rooms and see how things develop, if that's acceptable to you." "Perfectly acceptable," Sam replied immediately. "I told you before that I'm willing to wait for whatever you can give when you're ready to give it. That hasn't changed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky while the evening settled around them with the particular peace that came at the end of productive days. Clara found herself thinking about the wild horses they'd observed that morning, particularly the isolated Pinto mare who was slowly earning her place in an established herd through patience and consistent behavior. Perhaps, Clara thought, that was a model she could follow in her own integration into life at Riverside Ranch. Instead of trying to force emotions she didn't feel or pretend to be someone she wasn't, she could focus on proving herself useful and trustworthy, contributing what she could while allowing deeper connections to develop naturally over time. The approach had the virtue of being something she could actually accomplish, unlike the impossible task of immediately becoming the kind of wife Sam deserved. Clara had learned to be competent and reliable even when she couldn't be warm or spontaneous. Maybe that would be enough to build on, at least until the ice around her heart began to thaw. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Sam handed Clara another of his carved birds, this one a small owl with detailed feathers and wise eyes. "For luck," he said simply. "Sarah always said owls were good omens for new beginnings." Clara accepted the gift with hands that trembled only slightly, adding it to the small collection growing on her bedside table. Each carving represented another crack in the armor she'd built around her emotions, another small proof that some people offered kindness without expecting payment in return. That night, as she lay in bed looking at the wooden owl in the moonlight streaming through her window, Clara allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to deserve such gentle gifts. Someday, she thought, she might find the courage to let Sam see who she really was beneath the careful walls she'd constructed for protection. Someday, she might even learn to trust him with the truth about what her family had done to her and why she'd learned to guard her heart so carefully. But for now, it was enough to feel safe in this house, welcomed by this man, and slowly beginning to believe that tomorrow might hold possibilities beyond mere survival. The wooden owl seemed to approve of these modest hopes, its carved eyes, holding secrets about patience and the wisdom that came from watching and waiting for the right moment to emerge from hiding. The wedding morning dawned clear and cold, with October frost turning the ranch into a crystalline wonderland that sparkled under pale sunshine. Clara stood at her bedroom window watching Sam and Thomas load hay into the wagon for the cattle, their movements efficient despite the early hour and the importance of the day ahead. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Samuel Mitchell, a transformation that felt both inevitable and impossible as she contemplated the woman staring back at her from the mirror. Margaret O'Brien had arrived before sunrise with a dress that had belonged to her younger sister, carefully altered to fit Clara's slender frame. The gown was simple but elegant, cream-colored wool with pearl buttons and delicate embroidery around the collar that spoke of hours of patient needlework. Clara had protested that she could wear one of her own dresses, but Margaret had insisted with the authority of a woman who'd attended dozens of frontier weddings and knew their proper requirements. Every bride deserves something special for her wedding day, Margaret had declared while helping Clara into the dress. This belonged to my sister Catherine before she married and moved to Denver. She'd be pleased to know it's serving such a good purpose. As Margaret fastened the tiny buttons up Clara's back, she continued her gentle chatter about the day's arrangements, the food the church ladies had prepared, and the neighbors who'd ridden in from distant ranches to attend the ceremony. Her voice carried the comfortable authority of a woman accustomed to managing important occasions, and Clara found herself relaxing under the influence of such capable guidance. "Now then," Margaret said, stepping back to examine her handiwork, "let's do something with your hair. You've got beautiful thick hair, Clara, but you keep it pulled back so severely that nobody can appreciate it properly." Clara submitted to having her hair brushed out and arranged in a softer style than her usual severe knot, with loose waves framing her face and a few strategic pins holding the mass in place. When Margaret finally turned her toward the mirror, Clara barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The softer hairstyle and the becoming dress had transformed her from a careful, guarded spinster into someone who looked almost bridal. "There now," Margaret said with satisfaction. "Sam's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." Clara touched her hair self-consciously, unused to seeing herself look so feminine and approachable. The woman in the mirror seemed capable of things Clara wasn't sure she could manage, smiling naturally, accepting affection, building the kind of marriage that left both partners better than they'd been alone. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock at St. Mary's Chapel, giving the ranchers time to complete their morning chores before gathering in town. Clara spent the intervening hours helping Margaret arrange the simple bouquet of late-season wildflowers and sage that would serve as her wedding flowers, accepting the well wishes of neighbors who stopped by the ranch, and trying to calm the strange mixture of anticipation and terror that had settled in her chest. Thomas had appointed himself Clara's official escort, cleaning up until he looked almost civilized in his best shirt and carefully pressed trousers. His excitement about the wedding was infectious, and Clara found herself smiling more naturally than she had in months as he regaled her with stories about Sam's nervousness and the elaborate preparations Jake had undertaken to make himself presentable for church. "Sam's been up since 4, Thomas confided as they prepared to leave for town. "Checked his appearance in the mirror about 20 times, changed shirts twice, and I caught him practicing his vows under his breath while he was shaving." The image of Sam rehearsing wedding vows in front of his shaving mirror was so endearing that Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a sensation she recognized as genuine affection rather than mere gratitude. Perhaps, she thought, the feelings she'd begun to fear were permanently frozen, might simply need more time to thaw. The ride to Valley Creek passed in a blur of golden autumn landscape and cheerful conversation from Thomas, who seemed determined to distract Clara from any pre-wedding jitters she might be experiencing. Margaret followed in her own buggy, ready to assist with any last-minute details that might arise, and together they formed a small procession, making its way toward what Clara hoped would be the beginning of a new and better chapter in her life. St. Mary's Chapel had been decorated with pine boughs and late wildflowers, transforming the simple wooden structure into something approaching elegant despite its frontier plainness. Neighbors filled the pews, ranchers and their wives, townspeople. Clara was just beginning to know, and even a few of the unmarried cowboys who worked the surrounding spreads. The gathering represented the entire social fabric of Valley Creek, and Clara felt both honored and intimidated to be the center of such community attention. Sam waited at the front of the church beside Pastor Wells, wearing a dark suit that Clara had never seen before and looking almost as nervous as she felt. When their eyes met across the length of the chapel, his face brightened with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire building, and Clara felt her own lips curve upward in automatic response. For a moment, the gathered crowd and formal ceremony faded away, leaving only two people who'd found each other across impossible distances and circumstances. Pastor Wells had a voice that carried easily through the small chapel, and his words about marriage and partnership seemed to speak directly to the practical arrangement Clara and Sam had negotiated rather than offering empty promises about romantic love conquering all obstacles. He spoke about the importance of mutual respect, shared burdens, and the patience required to build something lasting in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. When the moment came for Clara to speak her vows, she managed to keep her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The words were simple, promises to honor and respect and stand beside Sam through whatever challenges their life together might bring, but they felt weightier than any contract she'd ever signed. Sam's vows carried the same straightforward sincerity that marked all his communications, but Clara heard something deeper in his voice as he promised to cherish and protect her for as long as he lived. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady and warm, and Clara found herself thinking that perhaps this practical marriage might hold more possibilities than either of them had dared to admit. The kiss that sealed. Their union was gentle and brief, appropriate for a public ceremony, but carrying enough warmth to suggest private possibilities that made Clara's pulse quicken with something that might have been anticipation rather than fear. When Pastor Wells presented them to the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Mitchell, the cheer that went up from the gathered community seemed to welcome Clara not just as Sam's wife, but as a permanent member of their extended family. The celebration that followed at the Riverside Ranch was everything Margaret had promised. Abundant food, cheerful conversation, and the kind of genuine community spirit that Clara had never experienced in Baltimore's more formal social gatherings. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in attendance, and the barn had been cleared and decorated for dancing that would continue well into the evening. Clara found herself swept along by the festivities, accepting congratulations and well wishes from neighbors who seemed genuinely pleased by her marriage to Sam. Several of the women made specific efforts to include her in conversations about upcoming social events and community projects, making it clear that they considered her a permanent addition to their circle rather than a temporary visitor. Jake Morrison, looking almost unrecognizable in clean clothes and a freshly trimmed beard, presented Clara with a wooden jewelry box he'd crafted himself, complete with compartments lined in soft fabric and a mirror in the lid. The gift represented hours of careful work, and Clara felt tears threaten as she realized how completely these people had accepted her as part of their community. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite identify. "It's beautiful." Jake's weathered face creased in an embarrassed smile. "Figured you'd need somewhere to keep those birds Sam's always carving for you. Man's got a gift for woodworking, even if he doesn't like to admit it." As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to relax into the role of bride and hostess, moving through the crowd with increasing confidence as she accepted congratulations and participated in the gentle teasing that seemed to be traditional at frontier weddings. Thomas appointed himself her unofficial guardian, ensuring she always had food and drink while regaling anyone who'd listen with stories about Clara's rapid adaptation to ranch life. The dancing began as soon as the tables were cleared, with a fiddle player from one of the neighboring ranches providing music that filled the barn with lively melodies. Sam claimed the first dance as his right as the groom, and Clara found herself whirling around the makeshift dance floor in his strong arms while the assembled guests clapped and cheered their approval. "You look beautiful today," Sam murmured as they moved together to the music, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, unexpected warmth spreading through her chest at the genuine admiration in his eyes. "Margaret worked miracles with the dress and my hair." "Margaret helped," Sam agreed, spinning her gently around a corner of the dance floor. "But the beauty was already there. I just don't think you let people see it very often." The observation was too close to the truth for comfort, touching on Clara's habitual practice of making herself as unremarkable as possible to avoid unwanted attention. But coming from Sam, the comment felt like invitation rather than criticism, as if he were encouraging her to trust him with more of herself than she'd previously dared to reveal. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself dancing with most of the men in attendance, from teenage ranch hands too shy to make conversation to grandfathers who told stories about their own frontier weddings while guiding her through simple steps. Each dance brought her closer to feeling like a genuine part of the community, and by the time the last guests departed under a sky brilliant with stars, Clara realized she'd enjoyed herself more than she could remember doing in years. Sam helped her clean up the remnants of the celebration, working alongside her to restore the barn to its normal state and pack away the decorations that had transformed it for the day. The comfortable efficiency with which they worked together suggested a partnership that might extend beyond mere domestic convenience, and Clara found herself looking forward to discovering what other ways they might complement each other. When they finally returned to the house, now officially their shared home, Clara felt a flutter of nervousness about the transition from guests to husband and wife. But Sam seemed to sense her uncertainty and made no move to change the dynamic between them beyond offering her a cup of tea while they sat on the porch and discussed the day's events. "Thank you," Clara said as they prepared to go inside for the night, "for making this so much easier than I expected. The whole day, I mean. I was afraid I'd make some terrible mistake and embarrass myself in front of everyone." Sam's expression softened with something that looked like genuine affection. "You were perfect, Clara. Everyone could see how much you belong here." The simple declaration hit Clara with unexpected force, touching a part of her that had been homeless for so long she'd almost forgotten what belonging felt like. In Baltimore, she'd been valued for her skills, but never truly accepted as part of anything larger than herself. Here, surrounded by people who'd welcomed her without reservation, she was beginning to understand what community actually meant. That night, as Clara prepared for bed in what was still her own room, but now felt different somehow, she thought about the vows she'd spoken and the ring on her finger that marked her as Samuel Mitchell's wife. The transformation felt both subtle and profound, as if she'd crossed some invisible threshold that couldn't be uncrossed regardless of what the future might bring. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly natural to Clara, each day bringing small confirmations that her place at Riverside Ranch was becoming permanent rather than provisional. She'd taken over most of the household management from Sam, freeing him to focus on the ranch operations that required his expertise, and had begun to implement small improvements that made daily life more efficient and comfortable for everyone. The wild Mustang herd had become a regular presence in the ranch's northern pastures, and Clara had taken to riding out with Sam and Thomas to observe their behavior and gradually accustom them to human presence. The process required enormous patience, but Clara found herself fascinated by the delicate negotiations between wild and domestic worlds that such work entailed. The isolated pinto mare Clara had noticed during their first observation had begun to separate herself more frequently from the main herd, grazing closer to the ranch's boundary fences and showing signs of curiosity about the domestic horses in the nearby corrals. Sam had begun leaving grain in strategic locations, creating a trail of inducements that might eventually lead the mare to choose domestication over the uncertain freedoms of wildlife. "She's almost ready," Sam told Clara one afternoon as they watched the mare investigate a grain station he'd established near the creek. "Another week or two, and I think she'll be willing to come down to the corrals on her own." Clara studied the horse's body language, noting the alert but non-aggressive way she approached the grain and the frequent glances she cast toward the domestic horses grazing peacefully in the nearby pasture. The mare seemed to be weighing her options, calculating whether the security of ranch life might be worth surrendering the independence she'd known all her life. "What will you do with her once she decides?" Clara asked. "Gentle her slowly," Sam replied. "Let her learn that humans can be trusted, that working with us doesn't mean losing everything that makes her who she is. Some horses adapt to domestic life easily, Others need more time. The key is reading each individual and adjusting your approach accordingly. As always, Clara heard layers of meaning in Sam's discussion of horse training, principles that seem to apply equally well to the process of building trust between people who'd been wounded by previous experiences. She was beginning to understand that Sam's reputation for gentling difficult horses came from the same patience and intuitive understanding that made him such a considerate husband. The breakthrough came on a grey November morning when clouds gathered over the mountains and the air carried the sharp promise of serious weather. Clara was in the kitchen preparing bread when she heard Sam calling from the yard, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made her abandon her work and hurry outside. The pinto mare stood in the main corral, separated from the wild herd. For the first time since Clara had been observing her, she was nervous but not panicked, moving restlessly around the enclosure while keeping a careful eye on Sam and Thomas, who stood outside the fence talking in low, calming voices. She came down on her own this morning, Thomas explained to Clara, his own excitement barely contained. Sam found her in the corral when he went to feed the other horses, calm as you please, like she'd been planning it for weeks. Clara moved closer to the fence, studying the mare's magnificent build and intelligent eyes. Up close, the horse was even more beautiful than she'd appeared at a distance, with the kind of refined bone structure that suggested excellent breeding despite her wild upbringing. Her coat was a rich chestnut marked with white patches that caught the morning light like scattered snow. "What's her story, do you think?" Clara asked, noting the old scars on the mare's flanks that spoke of hard living and narrow escapes. "Could be anything," Sam replied, never taking his eyes off the horse. "Maybe she was born wild, maybe she escaped from a ranch as a foal. What matters now is helping her understand that choosing to be here doesn't mean giving up her dignity." The gentling process that followed was a masterclass in patient communication between species. Sam spent hours simply sitting near the corral, allowing the mare to grow accustomed to his presence without making any demands on her attention. He spoke to her constantly in the low, soothing tones that seemed to calm even the most fractious. Animals, gradually building the foundation of trust that would make all future training possible. Clara found herself drawn to watch these sessions whenever her household duties permitted, fascinated by the gradual transformation taking place in both horse and man. The mare's initial wariness slowly gave way to curiosity, then to something approaching cooperation, as she began to understand that Sam represented safety rather than threat. On the third day, Clara witnessed the moment when the mare finally allowed Sam to touch her, extending her muzzle to sniff his outstretched hand before accepting the gentle caress he offered in return. The trust implicit in that simple gesture seemed to unlock something in the animal's psyche, and from that point forward, her progress accelerated dramatically. "She's remembering," Sam explained to Clara that evening as they sat on the porch discussing the day's developments. "Something in her past involved positive human contact. She's not learning to trust for the first time. She's remembering how to trust again." The parallel to Clara's own situation was so obvious that she wondered if Sam had chosen his words deliberately. But his attention remained focused on the mare's progress rather than any deeper implications his observation might carry. Still, Clara found herself thinking about the concept of remembered trust, the possibility that feelings she thought were permanently damaged might simply be dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to re-emerge. The storm that had been threatening all week finally arrived on a Saturday evening, bringing driving rain and wind that rattled the windows and sent everyone indoors for the duration. Clara spent the evening reading aloud while Sam worked on his wood carving the domestic peace of the scene interrupted only by occasional claps of thunder that made them both pause in their activities. She was in the middle of a chapter from one of Sarah's favorite books when a particularly violent gust of wind shook the house, followed immediately by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to split the sky open. Clara dropped the book and flinched, instinctively, her body remembering other storms, other nights when loud noises had meant danger rather than merely weather. Sam looked up from his carving, concern evident in his expression, as he took in Clara's pale face and trembling hands. "Are you all right?" Clara tried to compose herself, to return to the careful control that had become her default response to unexpected emotions. But something about the storm, the isolation, and Sam's gentle concern had weakened her usual defenses. Before she could stop herself, words began pouring out, fragments of truth she'd never intended to share. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking almost as much as her hands. "It's just, storms remind me of that last night in Baltimore, the night I left. There was thunder then too, and I was so frightened, and I kept thinking about what would happen if Charles found me before I could get away." Sam set down his carving and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to make her feel trapped. "Who's Charles?" The question was gentle but direct, and Clara found herself meeting his eyes for the first time since her outburst. In his face, she saw only patient concern, no judgment or demand for explanations she wasn't ready to give. "The man my father promised me to," Clara said quietly, "to settle gambling debts. Charles Whitmore, he already had a wife, but she was sickly, and he wanted—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the specific horrors that had driven her from Baltimore in the middle of a thunderstorm. Sam's expression darkened with understanding and something that might have been controlled anger. "They sold you." The blunt statement captured the truth more accurately than any euphemism Clara might have chosen. "Yes, like a piece of property to be transferred when convenient. The wedding was scheduled for the next morning, and I realized that if I didn't leave that night, I might never get another chance." "So you ran," Sam said, and his voice carried nothing but admiration for her courage. "I ran," Clara confirmed, "in a thunderstorm, with nothing but the clothes on my back and what little money I'd managed to save. I've been running ever since, in one way or another." Another crash of thunder shook the house, and Clara felt herself flinch again, despite her efforts to remain composed. This time, however, Sam's hand covered hers, warm and steady and completely unthreatening. "You're not running anymore," he said quietly. "You're home now, and no one, not your father, not this Charles, not anyone, will ever treat you as property. Again, not while I'm alive to prevent it." The simple declaration, delivered with absolute conviction, hit Clara like a physical blow. For the first time in over 2 years, she felt truly safe, protected not by her own vigilance, but by someone else's strength and commitment. The realization broke through the last of her carefully constructed defenses, and suddenly she was crying. Great, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from some deep place she'd thought was permanently sealed off. Sam didn't try to stop her tears or offer meaningless platitudes about everything being all right. Instead, he simply held her hand and let her cry, offering his presence as anchor while the storm of emotion ran its course. Clara cried for the family who'd betrayed her, for the innocence she'd lost, for the years of careful numbness that had kept her safe but cut her off from everything that made life worth living. When the tears finally subsided, Clara found herself curled against Sam's shoulder, his arm around her in a gesture of protection rather than possession. She felt hollowed out but strangely lighter, as if the emotional storm had washed away debris she'd been carrying for too long. "I haven't cried since that night," she whispered against his shirt. "I couldn't. It felt too dangerous." Tears. aren't dangerous here," Sam said gently. "Nothing about feeling is dangerous here. You're allowed to be human, Clara. You're allowed to hurt and heal and trust again, at whatever pace feels right to you." Clara lifted her head to look at him, seeing in his face the same patient kindness he showed to frightened animals and wounded creatures of all kinds. But she also saw something deeper, a recognition of shared damage, an understanding that came from his own experience of loss and the long journey back to hope. "Thank you," she said simply, meaning it more than any words she'd ever spoken. "For what? For not trying to fix me, for letting me be broken until I'm ready to be whole again." Sam's smile was gentle and infinitely patient. "We're all broken in some way, Clara. The trick is finding someone whose broken pieces fit with yours." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the warm house, Clara felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what marriage might mean. Not the rescue she'd feared or the business transaction she'd expected, but something entirely different, a partnership between two damaged people who might help each other heal without demanding immediate transformation. As they prepared for bed that night, Sam walking her to her door as had become their custom, Clara found herself hesitating on the threshold of her room. For the first time since arriving at Riverside Ranch, the thought of sleeping alone felt wrong somehow, as if the breakthrough of the evening had created new possibilities that her old patterns of self-protection no longer served. "Sam," she said as he started to turn away. He paused, something in her voice making him study her face with careful attention. "Yes?" Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she gathered the courage to voice what she was thinking. "Would you? Would you stay with me tonight, just to sleep, I mean? I don't want to be alone with the storm." Sam's expression softened with understanding and something that might have been relief. "If you're sure that's what you want." "I'm sure," Clara said, surprised by her own certainty. That night, for the first time since arriving in Colorado, Clara fell asleep, feeling completely safe, sheltered not just by the solid walls of the house, but by the presence of a man who'd proven that strength could be gentle, and protection didn't require possession. When she woke the next morning to find Sam's arms still around her and his breath warm against her hair, Clara realized that somewhere during the long night, the last of her emotional walls had finally begun to crumble. The wild Pinto mare chose, that same morning, to allow Sam to place a halter on her for the first time, as if she too had decided that trust was worth the risk it required. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Sam worked with the horse, both of them moving with the careful grace of creatures learning to believe in second chances. 2 months later, as Clara stood on the porch of the house that had become truly home, watching Sam train the Pinto mare who would soon be carrying Clara on rides through the mountains, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Baltimore's smoky streets to Colorado's endless skies. The woman who'd stepped off that train in desperate flight from an impossible situation had been replaced by someone Clara was still learning to recognize, someone capable of laughter and tears, of trust and love, of building a future instead of merely surviving the present. The wooden birds Sam carved for her now filled an entire shelf in their shared bedroom, each one representing another step in her journey back to feeling. The latest was a cardinal, bright red with wings spread wide as if ready to soar, and Clara thought it might be the most accurate representation yet of who she was becoming under the patient influence of Sam's love. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Clara reached for Sam's hand with the easy affection that had gradually replaced her careful distance. The ring on her finger caught the last light of day, but it no longer felt like a symbol of desperate necessity. Instead, It had become what it was always meant to be, a promise freely given and joyfully received, a circle of commitment that bound two people who'd found their way to love through the patient practice of daily kindness. "Happy?" Sam asked, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patience had been rewarded beyond his wildest hopes. Clara smiled, the expression coming as naturally now as breathing. "Happier than I ever thought possible." And for the first time in her adult life, Clara Hammond Mitchell meant every word. Spring arrived at Riverside Ranch with a sudden burst of wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in purple lupine and golden Indian paintbrush, transforming the Colorado landscape into something that belonged in a fairy tale, rather than the harsh frontier territory Clara had first encountered 6 months earlier. She stood in what had once been Sarah's garden, now thoroughly her own, watching Sam work with Thunder in the main corral while their breakfast grew cold on the kitchen table. The sight of her husband moving with such fluid grace as he communicated with the magnificent stallion never failed to capture her attention, even after all these months of witnessing his extraordinary gift with horses. The pinto mare they'd named Hope grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture, her transformation from wild creature to trusted partner now complete. Clara often rode Hope through the mountain trails that crisscrossed the ranch property. The mare's sure footing and intelligent response to direction making even the most challenging terrain feel manageable. The parallel between the horse's journey and her own had not been lost on Clara. Both of them had learned to trust again, to believe that safety could exist without constant vigilance, that partnership didn't necessarily mean surrender of independence. Clara's own transformation had been even more dramatic than Hope's, though it had taken longer for her to recognize the changes in herself. The woman who now moved confidently through her morning routines, calling greetings to Jake and Thomas, as they began their daily work, bore little resemblance to the frightened refugee who'd stepped off the train in Valley Creek the previous autumn. That Clara had been all sharp edges and careful walls, every gesture calculated to avoid notice or unwanted attention. This Clara laughed easily, offered opinions without apology, and had learned to trust her own judgment about people and situations. The change hadn't happened overnight, despite the dramatic breakthrough during that November thunderstorm, when she'd finally told Sam about her family's betrayal and Charles Whitmore's attempted possession of her future. The tears she'd shed that night had been important, certainly, a necessary purging of grief and rage she'd carried too long. But they'd been only the beginning of a longer process of learning to inhabit her own life fully, rather than simply enduring it. Sam had been endlessly patient with that process, never pushing for faster progress or demanding demonstrations of feelings Clara wasn't yet ready to offer. Instead, he'd simply continued being himself, kind, steady, present without being overwhelming, available without being possessive. He treated her emerging emotions like he treated the young horses he trained, offering encouragement for small steps forward while never punishing backward movement or temporary setbacks. The physical intimacy of their marriage had developed, with the same careful gradualness, progressing from shared sleep in the same bed to increasingly tender exchanges that left Clara marveling at her own capacity for desire and pleasure. Sam had approached her body with the same reverent patience he showed his horses, learning what pleased her and what frightened her, never taking more than she offered, but always leaving her wanting slightly more than they'd shared. Their lovemaking had become another form of communication between them, a language of touch and breath and whispered endearments that bypassed the careful words Clara sometimes struggled to find. In Sam's arms, she discovered that her body had not been permanently damaged by her traumatic experiences, that it could still respond with joy and hunger and the kind of abandoned trust that made her forget everything beyond the present moment. But perhaps the most significant change in Clara had been her growing sense of agency, her recognition that she could shape her own destiny rather than simply react to circumstances beyond her control. The woman who'd fled Baltimore in terror had been running from something unbearable. The woman who now planned improvements to the ranch house and corresponded with horse buyers from Denver and San Francisco was running towards something wonderful. That sense of forward momentum had been strengthened by her integration into the community of Valley Creek, where she'd found herself assuming responsibilities and leadership roles she'd never imagined herself capable of handling. When the school teacher position had become vacant in February, Clara had surprised everyone, including herself, by volunteering to take over the classroom until a permanent replacement could be found. Teaching the children of ranchers and townspeople had awakened skills Clara hadn't known she possessed, drawing on her education and love of literature to create lessons that held the attention of students ranging from 6-year-old beginners to teenagers, nearly as old as herself. The work had been challenging but deeply satisfying, giving Clara a sense of contribution to the community that went beyond her role as Sam's wife and partner in ranch operations. The children had responded to her patient encouragement with the same trust that Sam's horses showed, gradually opening up about their dreams and fears, their struggles with lessons, their excitement about futures that seemed limitless in this land of endless horizons. Clara found herself becoming protective of their hopes, determined to give them educational foundations strong enough to support whatever aspirations they might develop. Several of the older students had shown particular aptitude for learning, and Clara had begun supplementing their regular lessons with additional reading and writing exercises designed to prepare them for advanced education if they chose to pursue it. She'd written to educators in Denver and even back east, seeking advice about curriculum and resources that might benefit her frontier students. The correspondence had led to an unexpected opportunity that now sat on Clara's kitchen table in the form of an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Colorado Territorial Education Department. The letter inside offered Clara a permanent position as head of the new consolidated school district being established to serve the growing communities throughout the valley, a role that would allow her to hire additional teachers and develop educational programs for students across a wide geographic area. The offer represented everything Clara had never dared to dream about during her years of careful survival in Baltimore. Professional recognition, meaningful work, the chance to make a lasting difference in the lives of others. It also represented a level of independence and authority that would have been impossible for a woman in the social circles she'd once moved through, where ladies were expected to limit their activities to domestic accomplishments and charitable volunteering. But accepting the position would require significant changes in her life at Riverside Ranch, including extended travel to outlying communities and administrative responsibilities that would take her away from home for days at a time. Clara had been wrestling with the decision for weeks, torn between her desire to embrace this unexpected opportunity and her reluctance to disrupt the peaceful domestic happiness she'd found with Sam. She'd discussed the offer with Margaret O'Brien, who'd been enthusiastic in her encouragement, pointing out that Clara's work would benefit children throughout the territory and that such opportunities rarely came to women on the frontier. Thomas had been equally supportive, insisting that the ranch could spare her for whatever time her new duties might require, and that he'd be happy to take on additional responsibilities to free Sam from some of the domestic tasks Clara currently handled. But Clara hadn't yet found the courage to discuss the offer fully with Sam, afraid that he might see her interest in work beyond the ranch as a rejection of the life they'd built together. The fear was probably irrational. Sam had always supported her independence and seemed genuinely proud of her teaching success. But Clara's old habits of self-protection made it difficult for her to risk disrupting their happiness for the sake of personal ambition. The morning's peaceful routine was interrupted by the arrival of a rider coming fast from the direction of town, dust rising behind his horse in a way that suggested urgent news rather than casual visiting. Clara shaded her eyes against the spring sunshine and recognized young Billy Henderson, whose family ranched on the far side of Valley Creek and who sometimes carried messages between the scattered homesteads when telegraph service was unavailable. Sam had seen the approaching rider as well and was already walking toward the house, his expression alert with the kind of concern that any unexpected visitor might bring in country where bad news traveled faster than good. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, preparing to offer hospitality while hoping the boys' mission didn't involve serious trouble for any of their neighbors. Billy pulled his lathered horse to a stop near the porch, steps and touched his hat brim respectfully to Clara before addressing Sam directly. "Mr. Mitchell, sir, my pa sent me to fetch you quick as I could ride. We got a situation with some men from back east asking questions about Mrs. Mitchell, and pa thought you'd want to know about it right away." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of Billy's message hit her with the force of a physical blow. Back east could only mean Baltimore, and men asking questions about her could only mean that her past had finally caught up with her, despite the distance and time she'd thought would keep her safe. Her hands began to tremble, and she gripped the porch railing to steady herself while her mind raced through possible explanations and their likely consequences. Sam's expression had gone hard in a way Clara had never seen before, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something that looked like controlled fury. "What kind of questions, Billy? And how many men?" "3 of them, sir. All dressed fancy, like city folks. Been in town since yesterday, staying at the hotel and asking around about a woman named Clara Hammond who might have come west on the railroad last year. Pa heard them talking to the postmaster and the station agent, showing around a photograph and offering money for information." Clara's legs felt weak as she realized that Charles Whitmore hadn't given up his pursuit of her, that he'd somehow tracked her across the continent and was now close enough to destroy everything she'd built in Colorado. The photograph Billy mentioned could only be the formal portrait she'd sat for during her engagement to Charles, back when she'd still believed her family had her best interests at heart. "Did anyone tell them anything?" Sam asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made even thunder pay attention when training sessions turned serious. Billy shook his head earnestly. "No, sir. Everybody in town knows better than to gossip about their neighbors to strangers. But Pa figured they might start asking questions at the outlying ranches, and he thought you'd want to be prepared in case they come calling here." Sam nodded grimly, already calculating responses to a threat Clara could see he took very seriously. "You did right bringing word so quickly, Billy. Tell your father I'm grateful for the warning and ask him to send word to the other ranchers that we've got unwelcome visitors who might be asking intrusive questions." As Billy prepared to remount his horse for the ride back to town, Clara found her voice at last, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "Billy, did you hear anything about what these men plan to do? Are they just gathering information, or—" "Don't rightly know, ma'am," Billy replied respectfully, "but one of them was talking to Sheriff Morrison about legal matters and jurisdictions and such. Sounded like they might be planning to take some kind of official action once they locate whoever they're looking for." The news hit Clara like another blow, confirming her worst fears about Charles Whitmore's intentions. If he'd brought legal representatives and was discussing jurisdictions with local law enforcement, he was probably preparing to challenge the validity of her marriage to Sam or to have her return to Baltimore to face charges related to her flight from the arranged marriage. After Billy departed, Clara and Sam stood on the porch in silence for several moments, both of them processing the implications of this unexpected threat to their happiness. Clara felt all her old fears rushing back with renewed force. The sense of safety she'd built so carefully over the past months, crumbling in the face of evidence that her past had finally tracked her down. "I have to leave," she said quietly, voicing the conclusion that seemed inevitable given the circumstances. "If I'm not here when they come, you won't be involved in whatever legal troubles they're planning to cause." Sam turned to look at her, with an expression of such fierce determination that Clara took an involuntary step backward. "You're not going anywhere," he said flatly. "This is your home. I'm your husband, and no collection of Eastern lawyers is going to drive you away from where you belong." "But Sam, you don't understand what kind of man Charles is, what he's capable of doing to people who get in his way. He has money and connections and no scruples about using both to get what he wants. I won't let him destroy you to get to me." Sam stepped closer, taking Clara's trembling hands in his steady ones. "Clara, listen to me. You're not the same helpless woman who ran from Baltimore last year. You're Mrs. Samuel Mitchell now, a respected member of this community, with friends and neighbors who won't stand by and watch strangers cause trouble for one of their own." Clara wanted to believe him, but the terror that had driven her from Baltimore was reasserting itself with all its original intensity. "You don't know what he's like, Sam. Charles Whitmore doesn't accept defeat gracefully. If he's come all this way to find me, he won't give up just because I have a new name and a wedding ring. Then he's going to learn some hard lessons about how we handle bullies in Colorado territory," Sam replied grimly. "But first, I want to hear everything you haven't told me about this situation. If we're going to fight this properly, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." They spent the next hour at the kitchen table, while Clara related the full story of her father's gambling debts, Charles Whitmore's arrangement with her family, and the specific circumstances of her escape from Baltimore. Sam listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as Clara described the legal documents that had been signed, the money that had changed hands, and Charles's stated intentions regarding their marriage. "So from his perspective," Sam said when Clara finished her account, "you're stolen property that needs to be returned to its rightful owner." Clara flinched at the blunt assessment, but nodded reluctantly. "That's exactly how he sees it. Charles doesn't view women as people with rights and choices. We're assets to be acquired and managed for the benefit of men who know better than we do what's good for us." Sam was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through the legal and practical aspects of their situation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm determination that Clara had learned to associate with his most important decisions. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "First, I'm sending Thomas to town to wire our territorial delegate in Washington. Colorado's moving towards statehood, and there are federal officials who take a dim view of anyone trying to transport people across territorial boundaries against their will." Clara felt a spark of hope at this news, realizing that she'd been thinking like a victim instead of a citizen with legal rights that could be defended. "You think the territorial government would intervene?" "I think Colorado politicians are very interested in demonstrating that we can handle our own affairs without interference from Eastern interests," Sam replied. "Having some Baltimore businessman show up with legal demands about one of our citizens is exactly the kind of issue they'll want to make an example of." He stood and began pacing the kitchen, his mind clearly working through additional strategies. "Second, I'm asking Margaret O'Brien to send word to every woman in the valley about what's happening. These men might think they can intimidate isolated ranchers into cooperation, but they're going to find that frontier women protect their own." The idea of the valley's women rallying to her defense struck Clara as both touching and potentially effective. She'd seen how quickly news and mutual support spread through the informal networks that connected homesteads across vast distances, and she knew that many of these women had their own stories of escaping difficult circumstances in the East. Third, Sam continued, we're going to make sure that when these men do show up here, and they will show up, they find a reception that makes it clear you're not some isolated victim they can intimidate into compliance. Clara felt tears, threatening, as she realized the extent to which Sam was prepared to fight for her, not just as her husband, but as someone who genuinely believed she deserved protection and respect. Sam, I can't ask you to risk everything you've built here for my sake. If this goes badly, Charles could find ways to ruin you financially, socially, even legally. Sam stopped pacing and knelt beside Clara's chair, taking her hands again with the gentle firmness she'd come to associate with his most serious communications. Clara, do you remember our wedding vows? The part where I promised to stand by you through whatever challenges we might face? Yes, but... No buts, Sam interrupted firmly. I meant those words when I spoke them, and I mean them now. You're not facing this alone anymore. We're facing it together, as partners, with the support of everyone who cares about us. That afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to Riverside Ranch as word of the situation spread through the valley's informal communication network. Jake Morrison was the first to arrive, having ridden in from checking fence lines with the expression of grim determination that made him look like an Old Testament prophet preparing for battle. Heard we got trouble coming, he said without preamble, settling into a kitchen chair with the air of a man planning strategy. What do you need from me? Margaret O'Brien arrived shortly after, accompanied by her husband and carrying a carpet bag that suggested she planned to stay until the crisis was resolved. Dr. O'Brien examined Clara with professional concern, noting the stress symptoms that had reappeared with the threat to her security, and prescribed rest and reassurance while the adults handled the legal complications. Nonsense, Margaret declared briskly. Clara's not some fragile flower who needs protecting from unpleasant realities. She's a grown woman who fought her way out of one impossible situation and can certainly help plan her defense against this new threat. Thomas returned from town that evening with news that the territorial delegate's office had responded immediately to Sam's telegram, promising to send a federal marshal to investigate any attempts to transport territorial citizens against their will. The delegate had also contacted colleagues in Maryland about Charles Whitmore's business practices, apparently discovering a pattern of questionable dealings that had made him unpopular with legitimate authorities. Turns out, Mr. Whitmore's not as respectable as he likes people to think, Thomas reported with satisfaction. The federal boys are very interested in his methods of acquiring wives and his tendency to ignore inconvenient laws about women's rights. Sheriff Morrison arrived the following morning with additional information about the three men who'd been asking questions in town. The leader was indeed representing Charles Whitmore, but the other two were hired investigators rather than legitimate law enforcement officers, a distinction that significantly limited their legal authority in Colorado territory. They're bluffing, Sheriff Morrison told the assembled group, hoping to intimidate folks with fancy talk about Eastern laws and legal obligations. But they don't have any warrant, any jurisdiction, or any authority to compel anyone to do anything. Out here. Clara listened to these developments with growing amazement, realizing that the support network she'd found in Colorado was far more extensive and powerful than she'd understood. These people weren't just offering comfort or sympathy. They were actively working to protect her rights and ensure that Charles Whitmore's wealth and connections couldn't override territorial law. The confrontation finally came on a bright Thursday morning when three well-dressed men in a hired buggy approached Riverside Ranch from the direction of town. Clara watched from the kitchen window as they climbed down from their vehicle, noting the arrogant confidence in their bearing that suggested they expected immediate compliance with whatever demands they planned to make. But instead of finding an isolated woman they could easily intimidate, the Eastern visitors discovered a carefully arranged reception committee that included Sam, Thomas, Jake, Sheriff Morrison, and Federal Marshal James Patterson, who'd arrived from Denver the previous evening specifically to observe the proceedings. Clara stepped onto the porch, flanked by Margaret O'Brien and Dr. O'Brien, presenting herself not as a fugitive hiding from pursuit, but as a respectable married woman surrounded by friends and neighbors who supported her right to live freely in her chosen home. The lead investigator, a thin man with cold eyes and expensive clothes, approached the porch with papers in his hand and the kind of practiced arrogance that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than legitimate authority. "I'm looking for a Miss Clara Hammond," he announced, his Eastern accent sounding sharp and foreign in the Colorado air. "I have legal documents requiring her return to Baltimore to fulfill contractual obligations." "There's no Miss Clara Hammond here," Sam replied calmly. "There's Mrs. Clara Mitchell, my lawfully wedded wife and a citizen of Colorado Territory. If you have business with her, you'll need to present it properly to the appropriate authorities." The investigator's confidence wavered slightly as he took in the assembled group, clearly recognizing that he'd walked into a situation quite different from what he'd expected to find. "Mr. Whitmore has legal claim to this woman based on agreements made with her family and documented financial considerations. Her marriage in Colorado cannot supersede obligations made in Maryland." Federal Marshal Patterson stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present pay attention. "I'm Federal Marshal Patterson, and I'm here to investigate reports of attempted transportation of territorial citizens against their will. Are you claiming authority to compel Mrs. Mitchell to leave Colorado Territory?" The investigator's bluster deflated visibly as he recognized the federal authority he was facing. "We're simply attempting to enforce legitimate contracts made under Maryland state law." "Colorado Territory doesn't recognize contracts for the sale of human beings," Sheriff Morrison interjected dryly. "We fought a war about that particular issue not too long ago, and the federal government takes a dim view of anyone trying to revive such practices." Clara stepped forward, drawing strength from the support surrounding her and finding her voice with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I was never a party to any contract with Charles Whitmore. My father signed papers without my knowledge or consent, accepting money for a transaction I had no part in agreeing to. Under both federal and territorial law, no one can be compelled to honor agreements they never made." The investigator made one final attempt to assert his authority, pulling out additional papers and threatening legal action against anyone who interfered with his mission. But the presence of federal and territorial law enforcement, combined with the obvious community support for Clara's position, made it clear that his mission had failed before it began. Marshal Patterson examined the documents the investigator presented, noting several legal deficiencies that invalidated their authority in Colorado Territory. "These papers might have some weight in Maryland," he said finally, "but they have no standing here. Mrs. Mitchell is a free citizen who made her own choice about where to live and whom to marry. No Eastern businessman has the authority to override those choices." The confrontation ended with the investigators departing under escort from Sheriff Morrison, who made it clear that their continued presence in Valley Creek would not be welcome. Charles Whitmore's representatives had discovered that the isolated, helpless woman they'd expected to find had been replaced by a respected community member with powerful allies and legal protection. That evening, as Clara and Sam sat on their porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Clara reflected on how completely her life had changed since that terrified night in Baltimore when she'd fled into a thunderstorm with nothing but desperate hope for survival. "I keep thinking about that girl who was so frightened of everything," Clara said, her hand finding Sam's in the gathering twilight. She couldn't have imagined that someday she'd have the courage to face down Charles Whitmore's representatives, with a whole community standing behind her. Sam squeezed her hand gently, his voice warm with pride and affection. That girl had the courage all along. She just needed the right circumstances to let it show. Clara considered this assessment, thinking about the various forms courage could take, the desperate bravery that had driven her from Baltimore, the quiet persistence that had helped her adapt to ranch life, the growing confidence that had led her to teach school and consider new professional opportunities. "Speaking of courage," Clara said, reaching into her apron pocket for the letter from the Territorial Education Department, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." She handed Sam the official offer, watching his face as he read through the details of the position and the responsibilities it would entail. When he finished, his expression showed nothing but pleased surprise and genuine excitement for her opportunities. "Clara, this is wonderful," he said, looking up from the letter with obvious pride. "Head of the Consolidated School District, they're offering you real authority and the chance to shape education throughout the entire valley. It would mean traveling frequently, being away from the ranch for days at a time," Clara said carefully. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel about that kind of disruption to our life here." Sam's smile was gentle but definite. "Our life here is strong enough to handle whatever changes your career might require. Besides, this territory needs people with your intelligence and dedication working to build better futures for our children. I'd be proud to have my wife serving in such an important position." The simple acceptance and encouragement in his voice dissolved Clara's remaining doubts about pursuing the opportunity. She'd been afraid that success outside their domestic partnership might threaten the happiness they'd built together. But Sam's response demonstrated once again his fundamental respect for her autonomy and potential. "Then, I suppose I should write them an acceptance letter," Clara said, feeling excitement replace anxiety as she contemplated the challenges and rewards the new position would bring. "We should celebrate," Sam said, rising from his chair and extending his hand to help Clara to her feet. "Not just your new job, but everything we've accomplished together. 6 months ago, you were running from a past that seemed determined to destroy you. Now you're planning a future that includes professional recognition and the kind of work that will benefit generations of children." Clara allowed herself to be drawn into Sam's arms, marveling at the easy affection that now characterized their physical relationship. The woman who'd flinched away from unexpected touches had been replaced by someone who could accept and return affection without fear, who could trust in the permanence of love given freely rather than demanded as payment for protection. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" Clara asked, the words coming as naturally as breathing, despite the years when she'd thought herself incapable of such feelings. "Not since this morning," Sam replied with mock seriousness. "I was beginning to worry." Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch yard, where hope grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk. The Pinto mare had learned to trust again, just as Clara had, both of them discovering that safety was possible without sacrificing independence. That partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual strength. "I love you too," Sam said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patience had been rewarded beyond his wildest hopes. "More than I thought possible when I first wrote that advertisement for a practical partnership. And I love the life we've built together," Clara added, looking out over the ranch that had become truly home, thinking of the students she would teach and the educational programs she would develop, imagining a future filled with meaningful work and shared purpose. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her from Baltimore's smoky streets to Colorado's clear skies, from desperate flight to confident planning for the future. The woman who'd once measured her days by survival alone now thought in terms of contribution and growth, of building something lasting that would benefit others long after she was gone. The wooden bird Sam carved for her now filled multiple shelves throughout their home, each one representing another step in her journey from numbness to feeling, from isolation to belonging, from mere endurance to active joy in living. The latest was a soaring eagle with wings spread wide, and Clara thought it perfectly captured who she'd become under the patient influence of Sam's love and the supportive embrace of their frontier community. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now shared without reservation, Clara listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corrals, the eternal murmur of Valley Creek flowing toward distant rivers. These sounds had become the soundtrack of home, as essential to her peace of mind as Sam's steady breathing beside her. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the darkness, her voice carrying gratitude for everything. The safety, the love, the second chance at life that had seemed impossible during those dark months in Baltimore. "For what?" Sam asked sleepily, his arm tightening around her in unconscious protection. "For seeing who I could become instead of just who I was," Clara replied. "For having enough patience to let me find my way back to feeling again." Sam's kiss was gentle against her hair, warm with the kind of love that asked nothing beyond what she freely offered. "Thank you for having the courage to become her," he said. "The woman I married in that chapel was already everything I could have hoped for. Everything since then has been a gift I never expected to receive." Clara smiled in the darkness, thinking of all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them, school terms to plan, children to teach, horses to train, a life to build together day by patient day. The future she'd once been too frightened to imagine now seemed full of possibilities, bright with promise, and anchored by the kind of love that grew stronger through challenge rather than weaker. Outside their window, Hope whinnied softly to her pasture mates, a sound of contentment and belonging that echoed Clara's own sense of having found her place in the world at last. The wild mare had chosen domestication not as surrender, but as partnership, just as Clara had chosen marriage not as refuge, but as the foundation for becoming everything she was meant to be. And in the morning, Clara knew she would wake to mountain light and meaningful work, to a husband who celebrated her ambitions, and a community that valued her contributions, to a life so rich with purpose and connection that the frightened woman who'd fled Baltimore seemed like someone from another existence entirely. Some journeys, Clara thought as sleep claimed her, were worth every mile of difficult terrain they required to reach their destination. And some destinations, once reached, proved to be not endings, but new beginnings, launching points for adventures that earlier versions of herself could never have imagined possible. The last thing Clara heard before sleep carried her away was Sam's quiet breathing beside her and the eternal song of Valley Creek flowing toward tomorrow, both sounds carrying promises of continued happiness, continued growth, continued hope, for all the beautiful ordinary days still to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.